Well, good evening, everyone. This is so fun to be here at the Catholic Information Center, where I've come to so many talks for other people, so it's very fun to be here giving one myself. Like Angelica was saying, I'm a reporter. I'm the oldest daughter in a family of 11 kids. I was homeschooled Catholic, so a lot of the topics that I currently cover are informed by my background as a Catholic homeschooling nerd who cared a lot about culture issues. And growing up in a big family, being homeschooled, you're very aware, and we talked a lot about the implications of a Catholic education. We were very aware that public school education had detrimental effects on young children from a lot of the ideology that was being taught in schools. And I knew this growing up, but when I started reporting on it, I was very much blown away by the absolutely heinous state of education currently. And I started digging into some different stories that had to do with gender, family, abortion, marriage, but really with this emphasis on gender. And that is what has brought me to ultimately write this book on Detransitioners, thanks in a large part to Tom Spence and Regnery Publishing, my publisher, who's here right now, which is so fun. Detransitioners are a group of young people and older people who tried to do the unthinkable. They tried to become another gender, and they did this through hormonal surgical interventions. And then at a certain point, they realized this is impossible. I cannot actually become another gender, and I need to go back to living as my biological self. And it's a word that hasn't really been defined yet, I think in a large part to the fact that establishment media or mainstream media or legacy media, whatever you want to call them, isn't really opening to tell these stories. And I discovered this back in 2021 when I first started reporting on the topic. I had a really fierce editor who wanted me to do a story on gender-affirming care because there was this phrase that was popping up all over the place, and we didn't really know what it meant. It was very nebulous sounding, kind of artfully vague, clearly constructed in a certain way on purpose. And so I started digging into this phrase and what the ramifications of it were. And sure enough, I soon began to find that gender-affirming care was a euphemism designed by leftist activists to describe transgender surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers, even when we were talking about children. And to properly get into this topic, I think that we have to dwell a little bit on the media's use of this term because it has really transformed the way our culture looks at this issue and the way that we have been treating this very, very dangerous topic for young people, and how we have somehow gone down this slippery slope into saying that there are cases where a young person might need gender-affirming care, which is never true. So this is a phrase coined by groups like the Human Rights Campaign, the ACLU, GLAAD, which is an acronym that starts with the gay, lesbian, and then I don't even know where it goes from there because they've changed it so many times. But these are organizations that have developed style guides to specifically tell people, specifically media, how to talk about this issue. They will say in their style guides that explaining what gender-affirming care means is actually hurting trans youth. It's harmful to trans youth to explain what this euphemism means. So instead of saying in your story, when you talk about it, instead of saying transgender surgeries, hormones, and puberty blockers, you should say life-saving care or gender-affirming care or trans care, simple as that. And you'll notice this once you start paying attention in pretty much every story you read on the topic. NBC News, Associated Press, New York Times, Washington Post, when they talk about this issue, it's usually in the context of lawmakers trying to pass legislation protecting young people from so-called gender-affirming care. What they will say is Florida lawmakers are trying to ban care for trans youth, or Florida lawmakers are trying to ban gender-affirming care for trans youth. And the idea there is that the reader will read this sentence and think, oh my gosh, these poor trans youth are being denied care by these evil lawmakers. It's not even clear what the care is. Perhaps it's antibiotics for strep throat, but we're not sure. You know, there's a lot that could be going on here. And so that's the whole point of this type of media rhetoric, and it's been very successful. The polling on this topic, if you look at it, if it's phrased as do Americans support gender-affirming care, you will find much higher support for that type of phrasing than if you ask Americans, do you support transitioning children with hormones, puberty blockers, and surgeries? You're going to get very different results there. So with that background and the important context that when the media reports on all of this, they have very much bought into the line that this is good, this is affirming, this is loving, we should be supporting this. There isn't really any debate in establishment media's outlook on all of this. They will always include this detransition rate where they say only less than 1% of people who transition regret their surgeries, or less than 1% of people who transition regret this transition experience. It's a very flawed statistic. Often it only includes people who still identify as transgender, which is absurd that we're trying to talk about detransitioners. We're not even actually talking about them. And at the same time, there's researchers like Lisa Littman, who's probably one of the best researchers on this topic, who found that only 24% of the people who she studied, detransitioners, only 24% of those detransitioners actually went back to their doctors and said, I detransitioned. And the fact of the matter is that's, in essence, these people who went through all of these procedures, suffered very much spiritually, mentally, physically, and then when they realized, oh my gosh, none of this made me happier, they didn't go back to their doctor to tell the doctor, hey, I wish you didn't do all this to me, which is only natural. You know, we wouldn't go back to an abuser normally and say, I really wish you didn't abuse me. So there is a large quantity of detransitioners that are out there right now who haven't shared their stories. They're trying to resume normal lifestyles, and they should be able to do that, and I hope they can. But we have very misleading statistics currently on these detransitioners, and that's allowing the media to really misrepresent their stories and what they have been through and the dangers of so-called gender-affirming care. And now for this book, I interviewed a whole bunch of detransitioners, but I specifically profiled 5 people. That's Helena Kirshner, Abel Garcia, Chloe Cole, Luca Hine, and Prisha Mosley. And these are people who shared very intimate, very vulnerable details with me. I wasn't expecting to have many of the conversations that we had, and I'm a little bit embarrassed that my mom has been reading this because it gets very in-depth and very vulnerable. And I think that these are stories that have the power to really change the way our culture looks at this issue, because these are young people who were lonely, they were awkward, they didn't fit in at school. Many of them were on the autism spectrum and they didn't know it, or they weren't diagnosed at the time. And as they were struggling to find a space to fit in at school or at home, they also had family problems, such as a mother who is an alcoholic, parents going through a divorce, a parent that was cheating on the other parent and causing strife within the family. Many of these girls experienced a sexual assault at a young age. Many of them were exposed to pornography at a very young age. And all of them were on social media from a very young age, being exposed to all of the content that we know now to be incredibly problematic, from pornographic content, gender content, to just basic imagery of masculinity and femininity that can be so misleading for our youth. And we've seen studies and reporting from major publications on the mental health implications of social media for our youth. We don't often hear about the mental health implications attached to all of this gender content that they're also consuming on social media, something that I've asked about. Unfortunately, I'm not getting many answers on. But when it came to these young people who were in the book going on social media and first learning and being exposed to this gender content, I'll specifically share the experience of Chloe Cole because I think it's very emblematic of the rest of these stories. And obviously, as I share Chloe's story, I don't want to imply that everybody's story is the same. They're each unique in their own suffering and their own experience, but there are definitely attributes that are very similar to each other. And I think Chloe's follows a certain mold that is helpful for people to understand. So Chloe was growing up with her siblings several years older than her. By the time she was ready to hang out with them, they weren't at home. She was very lonely. She had masculine and feminine interests, but she wasn't really sure where to fit them in or where to fit herself in when she looked at them. And Chloe was lonely at school. She fit in better with the boys, but she didn't really know why. She was struggling to make friends. She was on the autism spectrum, and she did not know this at the time. And as Chloe was trying to find a place for herself, around 12 or 13 years old, she also first began using the internet a lot. She had social media, and she was very quickly exposed to pornography online. And this was something I asked all of the detransitioners about, because I think as Catholics, we all understand the gravity of pornography on our society and on our culture. And they were surprised when I asked them about it because it wasn't something that comes up a lot. But every single detransitioner I spoke with told me they had been exposed to pornography at a young age. And for the girls specifically, they told me this really impacted their understanding of womanhood and femininity. For Chloe, she's on social media and she's looking at these images of women. And as a young girl, I think all the women in this room know when we're younger and we're looking at women, we're not just looking at them, we're thinking, is that who I'm supposed to be? Is that how I'm supposed to look? Is this how I'm supposed to dress? There's very much an effort to find who you are supposed to be and copy them. And so for young girls on social media, that is part of the attitude of how they're looking at all these women. And as we know, on Instagram, for example, the women who receive the most accolades and praise are scantily clad. They're off on some exotic vacation. They're receiving lots of male validation, especially if they're showing more of their bodies or acting in a scandalous way. And so for Chloe, she's seeing this and thinking, I don't look like that, and I don't totally know how to be like that. It seems rather hard. And she's also at the same time being exposed to pornography. And as she and other detransitioners that I spoke to told me, these representations of womanhood in pornography were very degrading. They were humiliating for women. As Prisha told me, it did not look fun for women. It looked like the women were only degraded and the men were having fun. And so for both Chloe and Prisha and others that I spoke with, you combine this scary attitude of portrayals of sexual intimacy for women with these kind of unattainable ideas of womanhood on social media. And Chloe's thinking, I don't know how to be that, and I don't think I want that. And then combine that with the activism that she's being exposed to on social media with these gender ideologists telling her, oh, you don't think that you're a woman? That's because you're not. It's because you're actually a man. She was only too susceptible to this type of messaging. She's already wondering why she doesn't fit in. And so as she becomes more and more immersed in this type of content and language, she becomes more and more convinced that she is, in fact, a boy. And there's a lot of angles to this. I could talk about it all night. On the social media front, Prisha Mosley, for example, was severely anorexic. And she had been raped as a young girl. And because she was so anorexic, she could not carry the pregnancy. And she miscarried that baby. And it was incredibly tragic and incredibly difficult for her. She was very emotional when she shared this with me. And I honestly still become emotional thinking about it, this tragedy for this poor young girl who's already been through so much. And her anorexia drew her to these online anorexia groups, which are called Pro-An. And in these groups, a lot of these girls would post progress photos of their anorexia journey. So, as they become skinnier and skinnier, they post revealing photos of themselves, not realizing that these are basically what we would call nudes, but thinking that they're just showing their friends how they're progressing in their anorexia journey. And this very much bled into these pro-trans circles, where there's also a lot of pictures being posted online showing progress photos and the like. And so for Prisha, this slide from the pro-anorexia community was way too simple into the pro-transgender communities. And she also was told that if she didn't feel like she fit into a woman's body, this was probably because she wasn't a woman. It was because she was a man. And this is very dark, I know. And for these young people, this is us very much being submerged in very dark and depressing and sad content constantly. And they weren't really aware of this fact. They began to think of this lifestyle and this content that they were consuming as normal, as preferred. And at a certain point, they went to their parents and said, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy, and I would like it if you help me transition, because as minors, they cannot do it on their own. And this is a part that I find particularly tragic because I know we often talk about parents in the context of gender ideology, and we might be very familiar with the stories of parents who transition their kids out of a selfish and narcissistic desire to promote themselves. These are often the parents that will be posting about it on social media. They'll be trying to show that they are open and inclusive and they love everyone. And I've been to, as a reporter, I've been to drag queen story hours where I've seen parents like this who are very much there to talk about it later in the day, and they want to have some anecdote to share about their very inclusive experiences. And that is certainly something that happens. But I would argue that in most cases, the parents in these situations are also victims. They're just average American parents whose child comes to them and says, I am not a girl, I'm a boy, and I need you to help me transition. And for these parents, they love their daughter. They don't want to imagine her undergoing a double mastectomy. They don't want her going on hormones. They would love for her to have a happy adolescence, but they have no idea what to do with this. They've never encountered this before. They're not very politically savvy. And so they think, okay, I don't know how to handle this. Let's talk to the medical professionals. They'll know what to do. And so they'll take their daughter to a therapist, as Chloe's parents did. And unfortunately, in almost all cases, and this is not myself speaking, but all the detransitioners I spoke with, and you'll hear this pretty much across the board nowadays, when a young child goes to a gender therapist and says, I think that I am a boy or I think I am transgender, almost universally they're affirmed and told, yes, you are, and it's greenlit. And for the parents who are hesitating and nervous and unsure whether this is the right route to go, their gut is telling them it's not. They're told, if you don't affirm your child is going to be in danger. Your child might kill themselves. And what they're told across the board, and this is a quote, would you rather have a dead daughter or a living son? And that is, at the end of the day, a threat. It's a threat to parents saying, if you do not comply, your child will kill themselves and it will be your fault, and their blood will be on your hands. And so for many of these parents, they are not equipped with the resources to understand what's going on. They think that they're doing the loving and good thing to transition their child, and so they unfortunately trust the medical establishment, which has already betrayed them with this lie, and they proceed. And it's truly tragic, that parents are in this situation. It is an unprecedented pitfall for parents in modern day. And I was recently speaking with a parent who told me that his daughter is going down this path and he's terrified. And it's one of those things where you can only imagine the absolute agony of a parent who's trying to navigate this with love and compassion while not triggering their child to do the wrong thing. So I have so much compassion for these parents, and I think they deserve a lot of empathy and help, especially from Catholics, and especially a lot of support. And so once these detransitioners reach this point where their parents, will consent to these procedures, they will begin, if they're young enough, taking puberty blockers. And the idea behind puberty blockers is that it stops your puberty. And so for many of these young people, they don't really have any hormones in their system once they've been on puberty blockers long enough. And so when they begin testosterone, it's just this surge of hormones and excitement and energy for these girls who have been very listless up until now. Chloe Cole described it as a honeymoon period where she just felt so great. She suddenly had hormones in her body and she was able to, enjoy her life again. But then very quickly, the hormones set in. There's a lot of mental and physical side effects that she would never have guessed, and these other detransitioners would not have either. And that includes, on the emotional side, really extreme rage from the testosterone. These girls had never experienced rage like this before. They felt the need to physically externalize it. So Helena was describing to me how she would punch walls, wake up in the morning covered in bruises because she just couldn't not externalize this physical rage. She also described to me how she had an intense sex drive like she had never experienced before. And keep in mind, these are not young people who are very sexually promiscuous. These are young people who probably have never held hands with anyone in their life. And suddenly, they're encountering this very intense sex drive that they have no idea what to do with. Physically, they're experiencing hair loss, hair growth, coarser skin, bone changes, muscle changes. For some of these people, their shoulders become so heavy that they're not sure how they can carry themselves. Obviously they do, but Chloe described to me these aches and pains in her back and her shoulders feeling too heavy to walk around with. And there's also changes in genitalia when it comes to testosterone or estrogen. And I'm not going to get into that here, but if you want to read about it, it's in my book. And so all of these changes are coming upon them, and they're thinking, I am not totally sure what this is happening here. I don't really like it, but I was told this is good for me, and I just need to push through. And that is repeatedly what they are told. Keep going, keep going. You're going to be happier soon. It's this lie, this promise of happiness that keeps them going. And for some people, like Helena, thankfully they stopped at this point. For Helena, she realized this was too much for her. She was suffering so intensely, both physically and mentally, from the testosterone that she had to stop. She was hospitalized, actually. But for others, like Chloe and Prisha and Luca and Abel, they thought, okay, I'm not feeling better yet. The next step is obviously surgery. And as adults, we can all look at this and understand that this is terrifying and invasive and brutal, but in their shoes and in their situations, they truly believed that this was the thing that was going to make them happier and get them happy ultimately. And so for Chloe, that meant undergoing a double mastectomy at the age of 15. And wildly enough, today I saw Chloe posting that I believe it was 5 years ago today was the day that she underwent her double mastectomy. And she is now 19, and she went under the knife and had her breast removed before she could even legally drink. I was at a conference with her recently, and we both were on the same panel, and we spoke, and afterwards everyone went out to dinner together. And I was sitting next to her, we were all ordering drinks, and I looked over and she was perusing the virgin margarita section of the menu. And I was blown away thinking, oh my gosh, this young girl has been through absolute hell and she still can't even order a drink, but she was allowed to undergo a double mastectomy and give informed consent for that. She herself has said that she doesn't think she could fully consent to this surgery, not only because of her mental health issues, but also because she had no idea what the surgery would actually entail. Similarly, with the hormones, she had no idea what these hormones would do to her body. And frankly, none of the doctors do as well. With the recent release of the WPATH files, the World Professional Transgender Health Association, we found out that these so-called experts that are cited by every supposedly reputable media organization in our country, they were well aware that testosterone was causing tumors in girls. They were well aware that testosterone was causing infertility in girls. They knew that some of these kids had such severe mental health problems that they could not actually consent to these procedures. And they were discussing this internally, but had no intention of sharing it publicly because it did not fit the going narrative. And so Chloe and others are the victims of this silence, and they proceeded forward with their gender transitions in hopes that this would make them better, this would make them happier. And I think for most of these transitioners, they ultimately got to a point where they found that they were not happier. It got to a point where after going through the hormonal interventions, after going through the surgical procedures, and suffering intensely from the fallout of these. For example, Chloe's wounds from her double mastectomy have still not fully healed. They still require constant maintenance and dressing. She told me it's disgusting and it's time consuming and it's horrible. She got to a certain point where she thought, wait, I don't feel better. I'm not happy. And she had been looking forward to this promised happiness that all of these doctors and therapists, in a very spiritual sense, were promising her she would obtain. And she had not gotten it. And for her and for others, it was this moment of realization that things weren't better that made them realize, wait, potentially all of this has been a lie. And that is the moment, many of them told me, where things started kind of coming into place. And they started realizing, if I was lied to about this, perhaps I was lied to about everything else. And that's a really dark time for them. Some of them resorted to substance abuse. Some of them just completely stepped back from the world. For Helena, who did not undergo surgery, she took a job, I believe, at a cookie shop and was just kind of silently observing everyone around her and trying to understand humanity again and to really fully understand what her role in this world was. And at a certain point, these detransitioners either feel all right enough to kind of take a step back into their world and to disappear, or to enter the advocacy space. And I think that's something that not everyone realizes is these detransitioners who are speaking up, they had no one to speak up for them. So when they were going through this and they would look around for some prominent voice saying, well, this is how I felt when I got off testosterone and began living as a girl again, there was no one saying that. And so they've really only received one side of the story. And as I've already explained, we have this media embellishment and glorification of this transgender lifestyle. So when someone like Chloe was looking around for resources to understand her situation, there really was nothing except pro-transgender materials. And so once Chloe and others began realizing that they obviously were a girl and could never become a boy, it was a slow process of returning to that lifestyle, of potentially wearing girl clothes and figuring out how that felt. But now they had all kinds of complications. As I was sharing with Chloe, she had muscle and bone problems that are she's still trying to figure out the solutions to with doctors. And unfortunately, detransition is not covered by insurance, by most insurance companies. And so while Abel Garcia, one of the young men in my book, was not even trying to get what we call bottom surgery, he did get breast enhancements. Once his insurance company found out he was getting breast enhancements and approved him for this, they also just sent him a letter in the mail saying, just FYI, you're approved for bottom surgery as well, and he had never even asked about it. But when it came time to detransition, no one was willing to cover the costs of that. And unfortunately, there aren't really any doctors out there who are brave enough to say, I will be the one that helps these detransitioners to pick their lives back up and put them back together. So that's something I'm really interested in reporting on further, because there really are no doctors right now who have stepped in to fill the gap to help these detransitioners in their time of need. But thankfully, Chloe and others have stepped forward and begun using platforms like X, formerly known as Twitter, to share their stories. And these stories have resonated so deeply around the world. But I would say especially in the United States, they have gone viral. They have influenced so many people, and Chloe and others have gone on to testify before state lawmakers. They've testified on the national level. They've spoken with figures like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, and really reached very high levels of fame and notoriety, all while sharing some of the most vulnerable and intimate details of their lives. And so I have great respect for them. I think that they deserve so much praise, and I hope they're long remembered as the people who stood in the gap and really put themselves on the line to help other people understand what is going on here. But that was part of the reason that I wrote this book, was to help people have a good understanding of what they have been through that you might not be able to get in a short 5-minute Fox News hit, because their stories are more than just the fact that they decided to detransition. It's all the factors that went into it, the social media influences that they were enduring, their relationships with their parents, their lack of faith, their lack of community. All of these things contributed to leading them down this path. And I think that we would be remiss if we did not pay attention to these things and try and learn from them to help our next generation to grow up and to be able to have adolescence, to be able to go through puberty, to be able to enjoy being a child and not being pushed into very specific sexual boundaries that they shouldn't even be having heard of yet. And I chose to end this book on a rather sad note. The last chapter of the book is about Yaye Martinez. And I wrote the book in this way because the rest of the book is about people who made it, detransitioners who went down this path and ultimately decided that they could not live this lifestyle and they were going to go back to living as their biological sex. But not everybody made it. These detransitioners are alive. We're so grateful for that. They're telling their stories. But that is not the case with everyone. And in this case, Yaye Martinez is a mother from California. She is an immigrant. Her family lived in Southern California and had migrated from Mexico. And her young daughter, Yaye, in middle school, began identifying as a boy due to friends at school who also identified as transgender. And unbeknownst to Yaye, the mother, Yaye, her daughter, was being very much led down this path to gender transition in school. And the teachers were not telling her until she accidentally discovered it herself. Yaye was ultimately taken away from Yaye by the state of California and the Department of Children and Family Services. She was approved for a gender transition and began taking testosterone, and ultimately chose to end her own life by kneeling down on train tracks, holding her hands above her head, and watching as this train hurtled towards her. And when I was writing this book, and trying to understand what had happened with her story, I came upon the police report from the officer who found Yaye's body all over the train tracks. And it was one of the most excruciating things I've ever read in my life. I was so overcome with emotion reading about this officer, this poor man, finding her sneaker in one place and her leg in another, and having to explain to her mother that they had found her body and her daughter wasn't coming home. And I also had to read through the text messages between Yaye and her mother from only a day before, where Yaye was saying, "I love you so much. You are such a good mother. I'm so sorry that I'm so mean to you." And her mother was saying, "You're not so mean to me. I love you too. I'm going to see you soon." Just moments before she ultimately committed suicide. And tragically, Abby told me that after her daughter died, these pro-transgender groups started a GoFundMe in Yaye's name, advertising for trans youth who are persecuted by their parents enough to kill themselves. So that is what we were up against. And that is the alternative to this detransition. And I believe, as I'm sure you all believe, that none of these kids should go through this in the first place. They should be able to have a happy adolescence and loving parents. And if they are encountering this gender ideology, their parents should be equipped to talk to them about it and to steer them in the right direction. And I chose to end with Abby's story because I thought that it was really emotional and moving and a good reminder to us of what gender ideology can do to our children, and has often done to our children if it's left uninhibited. And as I was reporting this book, I called up the California official who approved Yaye's testosterone. And I found the forums where he's saying, yes, she's fit to begin this gender transition. And I signed off on it and gave her the green light. And I called him up and I said, I'm writing on this. I would like to include your perspective. What do you remember about this situation? And do you wish that you did not okay this girl's gender transition? And he could not even remember the story. She killed herself and threw herself in front of a train, and he could not even remember any of the details. And when I said that to him, "You can't remember? This little girl killed herself and you okayed her gender transition." He said, "Look, we have a lot of cases like this." So I think, I would like to close by saying I'm so grateful to these detransitioners who have spoken up, who have shared their stories and allowed me to share them in this book, and I hope they reach many people. But I also hope that these types of stories can embolden us to be able to talk about these things casually on the soccer field on a Saturday morning, with our friends at coffee, or maybe even as silly as on Instagram. And not in a aggressive manner, but to just empower us to have the facts, to know the stories. Because I believe as a reporter and as a Catholic that the truth will set us free. And that's what I was trying to do with Detrans. So thank you all for letting me speak here today, and I'd love to take any questions.
Feel free to raise your hand and I'll walk over to you like this young man is doing right now. Here you go.
Thank you so much for your work and just the research you've done and whatnot. This is a really big thing going on right now, so thank you for just bringing awareness about this. One thing I would like to say is just you talked about a lot of what the parents as a lot of how parents affect it and how what parents can do and stuff. But what can we do as just normal citizens and as Catholics and whatnot? And what are steps that we can take to sort of fight the gender ideology and stuff and prevent this?
It's a great question, and there are definitely people more suited to answer it than I am. But I will say something that I thought about so much when writing this book. I feel like I would go to coffee shops to try and get some quiet time, alone time, and I was constantly observing young people who were in these spaces. And as someone who was diving really deeply into this topic, I was so disturbed to constantly be encountering young people who very clearly were on the cusp of it or were already in the midst of this type of gender transition. And so I was constantly aware of the need to be standing with people like that, rather than just seeing them and worrying about them or wishing that they were in a different place, to befriend the awkward guy that's at the event that you're at that looks like he's struggling, and to befriend the young person who looks like they're in need of someone in their life. Because a lot of these young people were telling me that it was the lack of companionship and the loneliness that really drove them to be on social media to looking for this content. And I would also say there, one of my favorite books I've ever read is by Mary Eberstadt, who I've heard speak here. And it was Primal Screams. And she talks a lot about our cultural crisis and lack of identity. No one seems to know now who they are, or why they're on this earth, or what their family means or what their family roots are. And there's very much, as Mary would say, this primal cry of who am I, and trying to understand ourselves. And I think a lot of this is hinged on that, especially for young people who come from troubled families, who don't come from a place of faith. And that is the case for all of the detransitioners who were in my book. So I think we are very much in need of a cultural revival here of encouraging marriage, encouraging family, encouraging support systems where young people can thrive and they're not being pushed to turn to social media or fake families of gender activists. I hope that's helpful.
I love how positive you are. Thank you. That's what we need more of.
My question is, do you know of anyone or any organization or journalist who is tracking lawsuits against doctors? I've heard of a couple lawsuits against the doctors, but there's also against schools, we're pushing this, and against employers.
Yes, well, I am actually.
Good. Okay.
And I know I have a lot of other reporter friends who are covering these types of things as well. Chloe has sued, Luca has sued, Prisha has sued, and I believe Abel is about to sue. And Harmeet Dillon with the Center for American Liberty is behind a lot of these lawsuits. And then Campbell Miller Payne is another law firm that has recently kind of sprung up and is defending Prisha, or representing Prisha. And there's a lot of really amazing lawyers out there who have stepped into the gap to represent these detransitioners. And honestly, it's huge. The naming and shaming of these doctors and therapists and medical institutions, it's so much bigger than any news story that I could write would do, because that's a lawsuit. And, to have all of that documented, the explanations of how these doctors are walking a 15-year-old girl down this path and the very specific details in there, that rocks their world like no one else could do. So I'm very excited about these lawsuits. There's also so much legislation across the country. The SAFE Act, for example, is legislation that is popping up in states all over the country. The American Principles Project tracks that. They're really good about keeping an eye on that. And in fact, they're involved in passing a lot of this legislation. And they're a great resource there. Heritage Foundation, of course, is involved in most of that legislation and has some really good resources on it as well. So, and if that's not enough for you, we should connect afterwards and I can give you more resources.
Hi, Mary Margaret. Thank you for doing this, first off, writing this book. But my question is, how do you see this ending? Do you think this transgender ideology movement will end on its own by the exposure by great journalists like you of the atrocities that are happening to these kids? Or do you think laws will have to be passed in enough states to, like, how do you see this ending? Because it obviously needs to end. Right.
Well, I think the laws are huge and very necessary. The lawsuits are very necessary. And, again, I am a humble reporter and I report on these stories, so I wouldn't put too much stock in what I have to say. I think Ryan Anderson has some really interesting commentary on this, and he's kind of the godfather of the gender books anyways. But I would say that the detransitioners themselves are probably the most powerful weapon in fighting back against gender ideology. Their voices saying, I went through this and I suffered immensely and I regret it, I think is one of the most powerful responses that I have seen as someone that's been covering it very seriously for about 5 or 6 years now. I think it's all necessary, the lawsuits, the voices, and the laws. And, the whole menagerie of people who are fighting back together, whether it's local, on the ground, citizens. Like I had the pleasure of meeting in Colorado recently, at this amazing group of people who are on the ground out there in the thick of it. Colorado is so bad when it comes to gender transition craziness right now. I mean, I've reported on so many stories out there, from a girl being placed with a boy who identified as a girl on an overnight school trip, to schools transitioning kids without telling the parents. So many different stories like this. But these people on the ground, they're so effective, and we need more of them, and grateful for every voice in this fight.
Just want to say thank you for your courage. Just jumping back to the parent part, you said there wasn't a lot of advocacy. So in the wake of this detransitioning, has there been a rise in parental resources and parental advocacy groups for normal everyday parents?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to imply that there isn't a lot of advocacy, because there is. But I think that sometimes everyone is in very sequestered groups, and it can be really hard for parents to understand where to get their resources or who they should even be looking to. When you have a secular parent in, let's say, Ohio, that has their child say, I'm a boy actually, and I want to get a gender transition, that's a very crucial period of time that's not very long before this is going to happen. And so, a lot of this is very tricky, because when it comes to searching for things on Google, if you Google gender-affirming care, which I did earlier today, you're only going to get positive results. You will very quickly see that fake and misleading statistic that only 1% of people who transitioned regret it. You'll see all kinds of misleading statistics like that. You won't see these advocacy groups that are doing so much good. And so I think it's networks of people around the country that can really help each other. I'm in some different group chats with gender activists that are fighting gender ideology, and I cannot tell you how often someone will say, I just heard about a family that's struggling with this in X state. Can we provide them with resources? Who's a good therapist to connect them to? It's that kind of thing that will really help parents. But also, my hope with this book is to just tell their stories in a straight way, straight news, as we say, which just means we're not putting our opinion in it. And it allows people to just digest it without becoming angry or thinking that this is partisan. And so I think we need more reporters telling neutral stories that are based on the truth, because the funny thing about the truth is that it is the truth. And when you tell it just is the same. And what we're finding in most media stories nowadays is efforts to disguise and to cover up the truth. That's the euphemisms: gender-affirming care, reproductive health care. When we talk about abortion, a lot of the time we'll see major media outlets saying things like fetal cardiac activity instead of a heartbeat. On the right, a lot of the time, I've been happy to see my friends will just state the facts. And I think that has been really monumental in helping people understand what's going on.
Any other questions? Okay.
I found it so interesting when what you said about the doctors. I don't have full faith in Western medicine, but I'd like to believe that there's at least a few doctors out there that would help these teenagers. Why do you think it is that no doctors will step forward and be that help?
I think it's a combination of things. Unfortunately, the only people who have stepped forward are what we would call whistleblowers. So Dr. Eitan Haim, I always mispronounce his name, is a whistleblower from a Texas hospital who blew the whistle on the gender practices there. But he has now been targeted by the Department of Justice. He is under all kinds of investigations, and he's not actually practicing at his hospital anymore because of all that he has been through. So when you do speak out, as for example, Jamie Reed, who was at a clinic in Missouri, I believe, a gender clinic, you are no longer at your practice. And so I think that's one big inhibition for many of these medical professionals, is that when you speak out, you will no longer be employed. And obviously that's a hurdle that many people have faced in speaking about the truth. But there are a lot of different ramifications to consider. If you have a family, if you think that you might be of more good in the industry by being quiet and quietly trying to change policy from within. But another huge problem is that our medical schools are also slowly but surely, more and more prioritizing ideology over facts and science. And so in our medical schools, a rising class of new doctors are learning that they should choose ideology over facts. So, for example, Helena, one of the girls in my book, when she checked herself into a hospital in Chicago, she told them that she was a boy and that she was using boy pronouns, but she put on her forms that she was a woman, she was taking testosterone. And those people at the hospital chose to pretend that she was a boy and treat her for the mental health issues that she would have as a guy, rather than acknowledging that she was a woman and the testosterone was causing all of her problems. And that was years ago. So that's doctors looking at a situation and saying, well, we know this is a woman who's taking testosterone and that's why she's having all these breakdowns, but we're going to just pretend she's a guy and pretend she has mental health problems and treat her like that because that's what she wants to be treated as. And I share that story because it's the one that always comes back to me, and how utterly insane it is that our doctors are choosing to look at facts and science this way rather than actually helping us. So I think we're really up against it when it comes to the medical professions. They're very much held accountable by groups like the Human Rights Campaign, which check in periodically to make sure that all the hospitals are pushing gender-affirming care. But we do need more doctors to stand up, especially influential ones, the ones that have been around long enough and are renowned and know what their real obligation to do no harm is. But I just haven't really seen them yet.
We'll take one more final question, and then you'll have the opportunity to talk with Mary Margaret during book signing.
Hi, so thank you so much for your presentation. So I was wondering, you shared that Ms. Martinez, her 15-year-old daughter, was taken away from her because she wouldn't agree to sign off on her gender transition. That seems like a really younger age, but I'm just wondering how old a child would have to be before their parent could lose custody of them. You know, as a 6-year-old, I could think of many things a 6-year-old might want to identify as, and would their parent lose custody of them because they won't support their child's transition to, you know, a flamingo or something
Right.
like that?
That's a great question. I've been aware of this for a while because my mom used to be a social worker, and she would always get worried that we would be taken away from her for some superfluous reason, because at the Department of Children and Families do have the ability to remove a child from the family's custody based on certain circumstances, and that can be manipulated very easily. When it comes to gender transitions, in many states there are now laws saying that if you do not affirm your child, that counts as discrimination and they can be taken away from you. In fact, only today I was writing about a new policy in Vermont where parents can't foster anymore if they would not transition their child, or if they wouldn't be opening to helping that child transition. So it's effectively blocking Christian families in Vermont from offering kids a home. And those types of policies are coming into place all over the country. In California, and then this Yaye Martinez situation, Yaye was talking with her therapist at school, she was talking with her friends, and she was wise enough to know that if she told them that her mother had hurt her, that she could have grounds for saying that she needed to be removed. Now, I looked at all of these DCFS reports, I combed through them. Initially, they had this charge saying that her mother had hurt her, but in the paperwork, you know, all of her siblings are saying, we were there, that never happened, and DCFS ultimately cleared the charge and said this never happened. But unfortunately, it was too late, and Yaye remained in the state's care, and then ultimately we know how that ended. So I think that is a new horizon that a lot of the people, the conservatives in the advocacy space, are really trying to combat right now, because it is very dangerous. And there already have been cases of kids who have been taken from their families over gender ideology. I am currently working on a story about that happening in Oregon, so it is happening, and it's very scary.